This is the online lecture for Chapter 3, Part 1. You should use the information in this lecture to fill out the Chapter 3, Part 1 guided notes, and you, as always, should do this before you come to class. Now, in this part of the lecture, we're going to be discussing water and its actually very unique properties. All right, so water. Sounds exciting, right? Well, even though water is extremely common enough that it seems mundane and boring and kind of just average as a chemical, it's actually really interesting. If nothing else, consider these facts. 100% of drownings were known to involve water in some way. And 100% of serial killers have been known to drink water. So water is actually a really unique and can be a really exciting and dangerous chemical as well. In the right places, it can sustain life. In the wrong places, it can snuff life out. That's water. All living things depend on water. Water makes up somewhere between 70 and 95% of the volume of the average cell. Your body is about 70% water. That's a lot. Water is extremely abundant on our planet, and that's one of the things that makes the Earth pretty unique. Water covers about 3/4 of the Earth's surface, and it's one of the few chemicals that can be found in both a liquid, solid, and gaseous form in nature. Even though water is a very small molecule, it actually behaves in some really unique and interesting ways. And those properties come from the shape of the molecule. So I want you to think about this. Remember what you learned in the last chapter. Is water made of polar covalent bonds or nonpolar covalent bonds? Is it a polar molecule or a nonpolar molecule? And why? Now, of course, you learned in the last chapter that water is extremely polar. That means it's extremely lopsided. Within a water molecule, the oxygen and the hydrogen atoms can share the electrons, so they can zoom around the oxygen. They can also sometimes zoom around this hydrogen. But because oxygen is extremely electronegative, it's going to hog the electrons. And because it's hogging the electrons, that's going to give the oxygen a slight negative charge. It's also going to give the hydrogens a slight positive charge. So we have a lopsided molecule here with partial charges around the outside, and that's what allows it to do some of these really interesting, unique things. Because of the polarity of the water molecule, water actually has 8 emergent properties that make it unique among chemicals and important to life. I reordered these slides after having recorded it for the first time, so we're actually going to go over this one first. Instead of being property number 2, we're going to call this one property number 1, and we'll go over the remaining properties as we progress through the lecture. The second unique property is water's ability to hydrogen bond with things. Now, we talked about what the hydrogen bond is in the last chapter. Remember that it results from molecules that are polar, that have these little partial charges, and water is definitely polar. So when you put water molecules together, the positive parts and the negative parts of different molecules are going to be attracted to each other, and we represent that with that little dotted line. When water molecules stick to each other, we call that cohesion. When water molecules stick to other things, anything else with a charge, we call that adhesion. An easy way to remember this is to think of adhesive tape. Adhesive tape will stick to just about anything, right? So it's being adhesive. Water's ability to hydrogen bond is what allows it to form a surface tension. In other words, water kind of forms a little skin on the outside. And this occurs because the water molecules are more attracted to each other than they are to the air. So they make this little skin, and this is what allows them to form things like droplets. You may have experienced a surface tension if you've ever done a belly flop into a pool, because all of your skin is hitting all of that surface tension at once, and you have to break through it. It makes a loud slap, and it hurts. This ability to hydrogen bond is important to living things for several different reasons. One of the most important things that water can do because of its ability to hydrogen bond is to perform something called capillary action. So let's take a tree, for example. Inside a tree, there are tiny, tiny, tiny little tubes called xylem and phloem formed by the cells. And water travels from the roots, from the ground into the roots, into the stem, into the leaves, and then it comes out of the leaves and into the air. This is something called transpiration. Now, this is called capillary action because the tubes are very, very small. And what's happening inside those tubes is that the water molecules are cohering to one another. They're also adhering to the walls of those tubes, and they're literally climbing one another up the tree and out of the leaves. Transpiration is what allows plants to pull nutrients and salts and things they need up into their cells as well. So trees wouldn't be able to do this if water couldn't hydrogen bond. The ability to hydrogen bond is important to life in some other ways as well. This is what allows water to kind of stick to the inside of cells. It's what allows certain organisms like insects to walk on water. And it also allows certain organisms to form bubbles. Here, for instance, is a cool little spider that lives in fresh water. It's known as a pisaurid or fishing spider. And what this little guy will do is make a bubble filled with air, and then it actually goes under the water to hunt fish and little insect larvae and things like that. So it makes a bubble, and that is its scuba tank, and it takes it under the water with it. And it couldn't do that if water couldn't hydrogen bond. Now, because water is so polar, it is an excellent solvent. In fact, we call it the universal solvent, although that's a little bit of a misnomer, as I'll explain in a second. So what is a solvent? Well, a solvent is a chemical that dissolves other chemicals. So you can imagine water dissolving salt. It's acting as a solvent. The thing that's being dissolved is called a solute. So the salt would act as the solute in this case. And collectively, solvent and solute together are called a solution. So water is a universal solvent. That means it dissolves a whole lot of stuff. How does it do this? Well, let's take salt water as an example. When you mix salt with water, the water molecules go in and they push the sodium ions apart from the chlorine ions. In other words, they break the ionic bonds that were holding those crystals together. And look at how they arrange themselves around those crystals. Here, the water has put its negative charge as close to that positively charged ion as possible. And over here, it's flipped over. It's put its positive hydrogen as close to this negative chlorine as it can possibly get. So these water molecules are surrounding these ions and pushing them apart. And that's the reason that salt crystals break apart and appear to disappear when you mix them with water. Now, is water really a universal solvent? Can it dissolve anything? Well, no, of course not. If it could dissolve anything, you couldn't keep it in a cup. You couldn't keep it inside your body. So there are some things that water doesn't like to mix with, doesn't like to dissolve. But in general, because water is so polar, it will mix with anything with charges. So ions or other polar molecules. Water will even attempt to interact with large molecules. Here we see a bunch of water molecules trying to dissolve this big protein molecule here. This protein thing has some little charges on the outside, and so you can see that the water is attracted to those charges, forming hydrogen bonds with it. Now, since it can't break it apart, it will form all around the outside of this little protein, and it forms something known as a hydration shell. Here are a couple of vocabulary terms that describe how water likes to interact with other chemicals. First, we have hydrophilic. Now, that word literally means water-loving. So things that have charges, ions, and other polar molecules are hydrophilic. Water really likes to mix with it. So here, for instance, we have one of those quick dissolving tablets. It's very hydrophilic. Things like salt and sugar, those things are also very hydrophilic. The opposite of that is hydrophobic. That literally means water-fearing. So some molecules don't like to mix with water, like oil, which you can see over here. Oil is very hydrophobic. Oil tends to be very nonpolar. So things that lack charges and or are nonpolar tend to be hydrophobic. They don't like to mix with water. So again, polar molecules prefer to mix with other polar molecules. Here's an example. Here we have a bunch of water molecules, and you can see that they are all polar, they are all hydrophilic, and they're interacting with one another. And here we have a sugar cube. Sugar molecules are also polar, they are also hydrophilic, so when we put these two together and leave them to their own devices, they will eventually form a fairly even distribution of sugar molecules and water molecules. This tendency for polar molecules to want to interact with other polar molecules is referred to as a hydrophilic interaction. So what happens when we try to mix nonpolar hydrophobic molecules such as oil with polar hydrophilic solutions such as an aqueous or water-based solution? Well, in these cases, the molecules are going to go through a couple of different steps. Initially, the water molecules are going to try and surround each of the nonpolar molecules and make a hydration shell. Sometimes it's referred to as a cage around the outside of those molecules. But pretty shortly, pretty quickly, these nonpolar molecules are going to begin to seek each other out. They are not going to be attracted to the water, but they will be sort of attracted to one another. And so what they'll do is they'll kind of clump together like this, and then they push the water to the outside. You see this when you mix oil with water. The oil will initially go down, it kind of forms little droplets, and then those droplets come together and eventually form a layer of oil that floats on top of the water. We refer to this tendency of nonpolar molecules to clump together with other nonpolar molecules as a hydrophobic interaction. Now remember that inside living cells, there is a water-based solution, an aqueous solution. So we see hydrophobic interactions happening quite a bit inside living cells, and these interactions can help determine where certain molecules are located and how they're arranged inside cells, and it can even help determine the shape of certain molecules, as we'll see in the next slide. Hydrophobic and hydrophilic interactions can actually help determine the shape of certain molecules within aqueous solutions. Some molecules, especially the larger ones such as proteins, have some regions that are hydrophobic and other regions that are hydrophilic. So when you put a molecule such as this in an aqueous solution that's entirely hydrophilic, it's going to start to twist on itself. And it will twist in such a way so that it puts all of the hydrophobic regions, or as many as possible, together in the center of the molecule, and all of the hydrophilic regions towards the outside. This helps stabilize the molecule because it minimizes the amount of hydrophilic solution that's going to be touching that hydrophobic inner core.